Okay, so we're starting off the physical activity and health subject now. This subject is divided into three parts. We'll firstly be talking about prescription of exercise for health. And this first part of this topic is pretty self explanatory. There's a lot of basic questions in there. We'll go over some definitions of physical activity, of exercise, what is health. We'll talk about the benchmarks of physical health and factors that affect our physical health, and we'll talk about some of the guidelines for physical activity as well. So, like I said, nice and easy. Firstly, what is physical activity? It's any movement produced by skeletal muscles that requires energy expenditure. And this can be walking, running, cycling, gardening, just moving around the house. And there's an important differentiation to make, and that is what is physical activity versus what is structured exercise. So, structured exercise is when I make the conscious decision of going to the gym to do a workout, going for a run to do some sort of exercise or physical activity. Whereas physical activity can relate to things just like having a job that requires me to walk around a lot. That adds up towards my sort of physical activity. Moving around the house, gardening. So I'm not necessarily making that conscious decision to exercise to improve my fitness, but I am being active throughout the day. Now, there's a few different types of physical activity that you should know the difference between. These differences aren't clear cut. There's definitely some activities that fit into more than one of these different definitions. So, firstly, sport. The definition of sport is that it's a competitive activity that requires some sort of physical exertion using skills, techniques, or tactics. So, think like team sport or just a competition sport like skiing. You're using techniques, tactics, and skills to win a competition. Physical recreation is activities that we carry out during our leisure time, particularly for enjoyment. So if you enjoy just going for a hike and you've got a couple hours spare and you want to go for a hike or you want to go play tennis with your friends, that's a form of physical recreation. An outdoor activity is a really simple definition. It's just something that you do outside, something maybe adventurous that's outside. You're getting a bit of physical activity there as well. So, again, a hike, rock climbing, things like that. Physical education is what you would have done in school. So it's activities that are carried out during lesson time to teach young people how to participate in different sports. So, like when I went to school, they made us all do dancing during school, and we had to learn how to do dancing. They might teach you the rules of soccer, and you play soccer in your PE lesson. Physical fitness is when we complete a task or activity with the purpose of increasing our fitness level. Now, this might be our endurance, and we might want to increase that by going for a run to increase endurance. This might be going to the gym to increase our strength or our power. So, a few different types of physical activity there. And again, they're not clear cut. So, why is physical activity important? This is going to be like the major focus of this lesson. So, in its most basic form, it's essential for maintaining our overall health and well-being, and we'll get more into what that looks like in a moment. It reduces the risk of chronic diseases. So chronic diseases are our long-term diseases. Oftentimes they are caused from lifestyle. So lifestyle diseases and chronic diseases, they overlap quite a bit. For example, cardiovascular disease and diabetes, these can be brought on by our lifestyle. For example, eating an unhealthy diet and not doing any physical activity can increase our risk of cardiovascular disease or diabetes. Physical activity enhances our quality of life. So think about some of the mental benefits of physical activity, improving our mood, decreasing stress and anxiety, and also functional independence. So this applies more so when we're getting into older age, and people who are in older age might struggle to do activities of daily life like walking upstairs, doing the gardening, etc. So by being physical activity throughout our lifespan, we're able to maintain some independence as we get older, and we might find, climbing a flight of stairs easier than someone who hasn't been active across their life. So many different benefits of physical activity. There's 4 different circles here that you can see that have the 4 different groups of benefits. So of course there's the physical benefits, like increasing our bone and muscle function, our cardiovascular health, our balance, our posture, our weight. There's the mental health benefits, decreasing depression, increasing alertness and energy. There's also emotional benefits like happiness, mood, self-esteem. And then people tend to forget about the social benefits, but they are important to remember. So with physical activity, especially things like team sports, we're able to meet new people, build our social skills, strengthen relationships, etc. So many different positive effects of physical activity on our health within these 4 different components of health. We're going to delve more into these within this unit. So, what is health? This is a definition coming from the World Health Organization. You can see WHO there. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. It's not just the absence of disease or infirmity, and infirmity means kind of like weakness. So oftentimes when you think of defining health, if I asked you to define health, you might say to me, oh, you're healthy if you don't have any diseases or conditions. But in this definition, we're looking at not only physical health, but mental and social health as well. And the World Health Organization actually indicates that there's 6 components of health. So there's our physical health, which is the way our body functions. There's social health, which is the quality of our relationships with our friends and families. There's environmental health, which is about having access to clean air, water, and food. Emotional health, about being able to express our emotions in a positive way. We have spiritual health, so I like to think about religion here. So people who are religious tend to have some sort of direction and purpose, as well as ethics and morals and values that contribute to our overall health as well. And then there's intellectual and mental health, which is our ability to cope with the demands of daily life. So 6 basic components of health. Now, if we look at what actually contributes to our health status, what makes up our health status, about 50% of our health status comes from health-related behaviors. These are our lifestyle behaviors. So minutes per week of exercise, how much physical activity are we doing, whether or not you smoke, what type of diet do you eat. So these health behaviors are obviously going to contribute greatly to your health status, but it might not be as much as you would have thought, being at only 50% in this graph. About 20% comes from your genetics. So think about different family lines and different conditions that run within different families. You can see why 20% of your health might be down to your genetics. If you have a disease like cancer that runs within your family or someone that you know's family, no matter their health behaviors, they're going to be at a higher risk of getting that type of cancer. Obviously, they can reduce their likelihood with their health behaviors, but it's within their genes. 20% comes from the environment. So if you live somewhere that exposes you to infectious diseases or poor food and water sources, even if you live in an environment where the crime rates are high, or you don't have access to facilities for exercise, like safe facilities for exercise, that can affect your health and longevity, being the amount of time you live. 10% is attributed to other, so we don't quite know what's going on with that other 10%, but health behaviors is really the big one. So how physical activity affects our overall health, we're going to look a little bit deeper at this now. There's 4 main things. This is especially when it comes to physical health. There's 3, and then there's 1 looking at mental health, the last one at the bottom. So physical activity greatly improves our cardiovascular health. It improves our heart function and circulation. Now, what I mean by that is when you are physically active, your heart becomes more efficient. It's able to pump blood around your body in a more efficient way, and your circulation gets better as well. So if you think about your heart pumping blood more efficiently, it means that you don't, with each pump, you're pumping out more blood, getting more oxygen to the tissues that need it. And that's why normally people with a good fitness have a lower resting heart rate, is because their heart's so efficient, it doesn't need to pump as much as someone who has a less efficient heart. In terms of circulation, physical activity can affect the arteries and the veins. So if we think about the arteries, when we do physical activity, the arteries become more elastic. And that's what we want, because we want our arteries to be pliable and elastic to allow for the rush of blood that's going to go through them when the heart actually beats. When the arteries aren't elastic and they become almost stiffened, the blood rushing through those arteries has got no leeway. There's no elasticity to allow for that blood. And that therefore increases our blood pressure. If we've got a really stiff artery, it's not going to allow for that pumping of the blood around. So that's one way that we have high blood pressure. It also impacts the amount of plaque and cholesterol we have floating around in our arteries. And we're going to see that a little bit later on in this unit. But if we have a lot of plaque and fat circulating within our arteries, that can narrow our arteries, which also increases blood pressure and puts us at high risk of stroke and heart attack. Because if one of those plaques breaks off and travels to your brain or travels to your heart, that's how you have a stroke or a heart attack. Metabolic health. I want you, whenever you see metabolic health, think obesity and diabetes. Those are the two big ones. So exercise helps us regulate our blood sugar. So we want to keep our blood sugar levels controlled. When our blood sugar levels get out of control, that increases our risk for type 2 diabetes and for obesity. And then also helps regulate the lipid levels in our blood. So this is the fat level within our blood. So we want this to be regulated. If we have really high levels of fat within our blood, we increase the cholesterol within our blood. We increase the risk of the arteries narrowing with fatty deposits and plaques. And we also increase the risk of obesity, of course. The third one down is musculoskeletal health. So physical activity strengthens our muscles and our bones. It does this because muscles and bones respond to the stress that we place upon them. So if we go to the gym and we're lifting lots of weights, we're putting a lot of stress on our muscles and our bones. Our muscles and our bones are going to think, oh gosh, I need to be bigger to handle this amount of stress that's being put on me in this gym. And that's why our muscles grow bigger, we have hypertrophy, and our bones grow more dense and stronger. If I just lie in bed all day and don't do anything, I don't move a muscle, my muscles and bones get that message that, okay, we're not doing anything. I don't need to be strong. Why am I, getting bigger? I might as well get smaller because I'm not doing anything at all. So our muscles actually can atrophy. They become smaller when I don't put any demand on them, and my bones become more brittle. And then, of course, there's the mental health benefits. So exercise enhances our mood, not only our mood, but it can decrease anxiety and depression. And it also enhances our cognitive function. So cognitive function is referring to the brain functioning. So things like memory, recall, attention are all going to be positively influenced by physical activity. Okay, so here are our physical activity guidelines for different age groups. So you'll notice that there's 3 different guidelines for each age group. There's physical activity guideline, there's the sedentary or screen-based behavior guideline, and there's the strength guideline. So that term sedentary just means time sitting down, like screen time basically, time doing nothing, where you're sat on the couch watching TV or you're sat in class working on your computer. That's sedentary time. So let's look at age 2 to 5. Now the physical activity guideline here is at least 180 minutes per day. Kids at this age obviously aren't going to be going out on a run for 180 minutes per day, but they get their physical activity just from moving around, playing with their friends, chasing each other around in the backyard, whatever it is. But it's not like a structured physical activity. For the sedentary and screen-based behavior guideline, it says that they should not be restrained for more than 60 minutes at a time and no more than 60 minutes of sedentary screen time per day. Now, what we're going to see for this sedentary and screen-based behavior guideline is that it's actually very hard to meet. There's not many people who meet this guideline. Remember, it is just a guideline, and if you don't meet them, that's fine. It's just something for you to work towards. But in terms of the sedentary guideline, they're almost impossible to meet, especially for kids who are at school, or if you have a desk job, it's almost impossible to actually tick off this sedentary guideline. For strength, there's no recommendation, not applicable is what NA means. So not applicable for strength for kids aged 2 to 5. For ages 5 to 17, for physical activity, we have at least 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity per day. We're going to talk more about what this moderate to vigorous means later on, but just for now, think of it as, okay, you're breathing pretty hard. It's not just like a leisurely walk. I'm talking more like a power walk up to running here. So 60 minutes per day. No more than 120 minutes of screen use. So see how I said that not many people are meeting this guideline here, and I bet most of you aren't meeting this guideline. You can have a look at your phones and check your screen time if you want to. And then it's got break up long periods of sitting. So it's not good to be sat doing a sedentary behavior for a really long period of time. And again, we're going to see why that is in a moment. For strength, it's suggested we have muscle strengthening activities across the week, but not a specific guideline there. All right, let's have a look at adults now. So for ages 18 to 64, we have at least 150 minutes of moderate or 75 minutes of vigorous activity over 5 sessions per week. So that's really important. Now, it can be any combination of the 150 minutes moderate or 75 minutes vigorous. You can do a combination of that. That's no problem. But it is important that it's spread out across the week. So you don't want to just go on a 75-minute run on Monday and then spend Tuesday to Sunday doing no activity at all. We want that activity to be sort of consistent throughout the week. For sedentary, it says minimize and break up prolonged periods of sitting. So again, not really a specific guideline there. For strength, it recommends muscle strengthening activities 2 times per week. For ages 65 and over, we've got be active on most, preferably all days, with at least 30 minutes of moderate activity per day. So that could be a 30-minute walk. Be as active as possible in terms of the sedentary guideline. Again, a really sort of random guideline that doesn't really give us any specific details. And then for strength, we've got incorporate balance and muscle strengthening activities. Now, balance activities are really important for older people because one of the big risks when we get older is falls. Now, an older person having a fall can be really, really bad. They can end up in hospital with a hip fracture. And when you're older, you don't bounce back from an injury like that very easily. So that can cause some really long-term issues. So when we get older, we want to make sure we're doing some sort of balance exercises. Now, there's really specific balance exercises, like, you know, when you stand on the Bozu ball and try and sort of stay upright and maybe catch a ball at the same time. Even things like tennis is considered a balance exercise just because of the way that you're moving around from foot to foot. Okay, now in terms of definitions that we need to talk about related to the level of physical activity, we have a few here. So if you are inactive, it means you aren't getting any moderate or vigorous intensity physical activity beyond basic movement from daily life. So insufficiently active is doing some moderate or vigorous physical activity, but less than the guidelines. And that's the guideline for adults. Remember, 150 minutes of moderate or 75 minutes of vigorous. Active is meeting the guidelines up to 300 minutes. So it's the equivalent of 150 minutes to 300 minutes of physical activity per week. And then highly active is when you're doing more than 300 minutes of physical activity per week. So let's talk more about what this moderate and vigorous intensity means now. And in order to do that, we need to understand something called METs, because activity intensity is measured in the form of METs, which is metabolic equivalence. So A MET is the metabolic cost of an activity compared with your basal or resting metabolic rate. They're the same thing in this context. So 1 MET is your resting metabolic rate. It's the amount of calories or of energy that you burn just resting, doing nothing. So if I, lied down for 10 minutes and calculated how much I was burning in terms of calories, that's the equivalent of 1 MET. Now it gets interesting when we look at 2 METs, because 2 METs is activity that is 2 times the resting metabolic rate. So if my resting metabolic rate was 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute, you don't need to worry too much about those units, just look at the number, 3.5. That means that 2 METs must be 7. And that means that 3 METs must be 10.5, and so on. 10 METs is 10 times the resting metabolic rate. So you can calculate your resting metabolic rate. Now, remember the 3.5 and the 7 are per minute. So normally if you go onto a website to calculate your resting metabolic rate, it will show you across the day. So you can't really apply it in the same context, but just notice that MET sort of calculation and what that means. 1 MET is your resting metabolic rate, 2 METs is 2 times that, 3 METs is 3 times that, etc. So if we have a look at our different intensity exercises now, we've got light intensity exercise, and that is non-sedentary behavior. So it's not sitting down or watching TV. It means you're moving slightly, but you're not moving any more than 3 METs. So it's less than 3 METs. Things like walking at a slow pace, cooking, doing some household chores. Moderate intensity activity is 3 to 6 METs, 3 to 6 times the resting metabolic rate. Also remember that everyone's resting metabolic rate is slightly different, so this could look different for 2 different people. Examples are walking briskly, so a little bit faster now, playing doubles tennis. Obviously, you can play tennis at a vigorous intensity, or you can play it at a lighter intensity or at a moderate intensity. It sort of depends how you're playing. So take it with a grain of salt. These aren't like hard and fast rules. This would be playing doubles tennis, but like just a friendly game where I'm just hitting the ball, moving around a little bit, but I'm not working too hard. And then raking the yard is another example. For vigorous intensity activity, it's 6 or more METs. So running, jogging, doing like a CrossFit class. And it's interesting because many adults don't actually do any vigorous intensity physical activity. They're not getting their heart rate and their breathing up enough to be considered as doing vigorous intensity physical activity. So that's something that you might want to consider moving forwards. Okay, and then again we have our different categories, light, moderate, and vigorous. There's also very vigorous on here as well, but the one I want you guys to look at now is sedentary. So I've already said sedentary behavior is when you're sitting down watching TV, playing video games, working at a desk, whatever it is. Now it's really interesting because, as we're about to see here, a sedentary behavior is classed as anything equal to or less than 1.5 METs. Remember, sitting, reclining, lying down. Importantly, it does not include sleeping. Sleeping is separate. It's not considered a sedentary behavior. But what is interesting is that you can be both physically active and sedentary. So let's have a look at how that might work. How can I be physically active and sedentary at the same time? So on this graph here, we've got METs up the y-axis and time along the x-axis, and we've got the plot of 2 different people on this graph. So person 1 is the black dots and person 2 is the white dots. So let's look at the black dots first. So they wake up at 9 a.m. and they're already above that cutoff of 1.5 METs of sedentary behavior. So you can see the grey line, the grey strip at the bottom, that's representing anything within the sedentary behavior sort of cutoff. So if he's above that grey strip, that means he's not being sedentary. So he's above that grey strip. Then there's a sharp peak, and that sharp peak might mean he went to the gym, went for a jog, something like that. Then he comes back down and his line, dips slightly into the sedentary grey, but it mostly stays above it for the rest of the day. That's the opposite of the white dots. So the white dots, straight away from 9 a.m., remaining in that sedentary time. Then there's the peak. That peak, again, might be going to the gym, might be going for a jog. And then he comes back home and he's back in the sedentary line until 9 p.m. So of these two, which one do you think would have better health outcomes? It's going to be the black dots. So the black dots is better than the white dots. Less sedentary time, better for your health. Let's have a look now at this graph here. So here, again, we have two different people. Person 1 and person 2 are the two separate columns. The black within each of those columns represents sedentary time, and the white represents non-sedentary time, so being a bit more active than sedentary. Now, what's really interesting is if you were to add up these two columns, they would actually have the exact same amount of black, even though it looks like person 2 has less because it's more spread out. So person 1 is someone who prolongs their sedentary time. They've got big, thick black bars within their column. Versus person 2 who breaks up their sedentary time. So you can see that the black is a lot more thin. There's not those big, thick chunks like there is for person number 1. Now, to be a breaker, it doesn't mean that you're going out for a run or for a walk every couple of minutes to break up your sedentary time. It's way more simple than that. It just means, you might be watching TV or working on the computer, but every, hour or so, you're standing up, going for a little walk around the office, making a coffee, going to the bathroom. You're just breaking up that time, not necessarily with exercise, but with just being a little bit more active. Now, even though these two people have the exact same amount of sedentary time across their day, the breaker is in a better position in terms of when we look at health. And they're not exactly sure why that is. Why is breaking up your sedentary time better for your health? But there's been some investigations that have shown that animal studies, when they look at rats, for example, it shows that when we don't break the sedentary time, when I'm just sat watching TV for 6 hours and I don't even get up to go to the bathroom, it shows that it impairs the metabolism of fat and cholesterol. So I have more fat and more cholesterol circulating in my system because I'm not getting up, I'm not using my body to move around. That fat and that cholesterol is not being flushed out. So with more fat and cholesterol within my system, it means that more fat that's circulating in the blood system might get stored as adipose tissue, as actual fat in my body, and cholesterol might become plaques within my arterial system. So I might get those plaques and that narrowing of my arteries if I do this prolonged inactivity. You can see in the graph, we've got waist circumference up the y-axis and quartiles of breaks in sedentary time along the x-axis. So have a look at Q1 for me. Basically, this is people who didn't break up their sedentary time. These are the prolongers. And Q4 is the breakers. So Q1 is the prolongers, Q4 is the breakers. And you can see that the breakers have a much lower waist circumference overall. So just by breaking up that sedentary time, it can decrease it's shown trends for decreasing our waist circumference. Another interesting thing is that they've shown that fidgeting might be a way to sort of increase your health if you are someone who sits down for a long period of time. Just fidgeting, like tapping your leg or tapping your fingers, can actually improve health outcomes over long periods of time. So it's important to be moving. Okay, so we know that there's a strong relationship between sedentary behavior and health outcomes, and this is looking at the relationship between sedentary behavior and the risk of all-cause mortality. So what that means is pretty much death from any cause. Now this figure shows moderate to vigorous physical activity in minutes on the x-axis and daily sitting time in hours on the y-axis. Red represents a higher risk of all-cause mortality, a higher risk of death, no matter what from. And green represents a lower risk of death. So there's a couple of conclusions that we can make from this graph here. first one is that high volumes of moderate to vigorous physical activity appear to remove the excess risk of death that's associated with high volumes of sitting. So even if I'm sitting a lot of the day, if I'm doing a lot of moderate to vigorous physical activity, I can put myself in the green, and I'm looking at the green in the top right hand corner for this sort of conclusion. Next conclusion is that very low time spent sitting reduces but doesn't eliminate the risk of no moderate to vigorous physical activity. So if I'm never sitting down, I'm working a job where I'm stood up all day, but I don't do any moderate to vigorous physical activity, I'm still in the red. I'm looking at the bottom left-hand corner now, so the reddy orange area there. So even if I'm not sitting, I still have quite a high risk if I'm not doing any moderate to vigorous physical activity. So a couple of interesting conclusions that we can make from this graph. Now, in terms of barriers and trends for exercise, we're going to go through some of the basic barriers for exercise in the specific age groups. For 5 to 12-year-olds, the most common sport that they complete or activity that they do is swimming, soccer, and gymnastics. And the reason why they don't do physical activity, if they don't do any, is these are the barriers to participation, is firstly because they're the wrong age. This probably comes from the parents telling them, no, you're too young to do that. They don't have enough time or too many commitments, and also that they can't afford it, or they can't afford the transport to and from wherever they need to go to complete that activity. For 13 to 17-year-olds, the most common activities are soccer, going to the gym, and athletics, track and field, including jogging. Their barriers to participation, so the reason that they don't do exercise, is because they don't like it or they're not interested in it. They don't have enough time, or they have too many commitments. And then the last one is they're just too lazy. And then finally, for adults, we don't have the most common sports for adults, but we do have the barriers. So first one, again, not enough time. You can see that comes up in every single age group. Poor health or injury is a big one when we get to adulthood, and then too lazy as well. Motivators to participate. So if I asked a bunch of people who do physical activity, why do they do physical activity? The first thing they say is it's good for my health or fitness. The next common is they have fun and enjoy it. And then the last reason is the social reasons. So they make friends, they interact with people, they might be at a job all day that they don't like, and they don't like anyone there and don't talk to anyone, but then they go to, a group class at the gym where they're happy and chatting with people. So exercise does have a big social component as well. All right, we're going to talk now about factors affecting our physical health. Now, again, this is pretty self-explanatory. If I asked you, tell me some factors that might affect your physical health. Firstly, you're probably going to tell me the amount of physical activity that you do, and that would be correct. And we've spent all of this time talking about it. It improves our cardiovascular health, weight management, gives us stronger muscles and bones, enhances our mental well-being. We get better sleep, reduced risk of chronic disease, and improved immune function. So exercise can enhance the immune system and reduce the risk of illness and infection. So physical activity, of course, affects our physical health. The next one is whether or not we have any medical conditions. So diabetes can lead to high blood sugar levels, nerve damage, cardiovascular complications, and it impacts our overall physical health massively. We've got hypertension, which is high blood pressure. This increases the risk of heart disease and stroke, and potentially might lead to reduced sort of stamina. So we might struggle to complete physical activity if we have hypertension. Asthma affects our health, causing breathing difficulties. Arthritis leads to joint pain and stiffness, which can impair movement and reduce physical activity levels. We have heart disease, which can lead to a whole massive bunch of symptoms like chest pains and fatigue. And then obesity as well, which is associated with a range of health issues like diabetes, like heart disease, like high blood pressure, joint problems. It affects our overall health and predisposes us to a lot of these conditions listed above. The next thing that affects our physical health is our lifestyle and diet. So this one again is quite an obvious one. So are we getting enough sleep? Are we drinking enough water to support our bodily functions and our digestion? Are we having a good nutrition intake? We're getting lots of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, lean proteins for these essential nutrients. Are we maintaining and managing our weight? So healthy diet helps to maintain our weight, reduces the risk of obesity and all of the obesity related conditions. Blood sugar control. So with a good diet and balanced carbohydrates, we can manage our blood sugar, reduce the risk of diabetes. If we're eating a whole lot of processed sugars and saturated fats, that can become an issue. And of course, our lifestyle and diet affect our heart health as well. So diets with lots of omega-3s, so think like salmon and fatty fish, and low in saturated fats, so not too much butter or animal fat, supports our cardiovascular health and reduces the risk of heart disease. So lifestyle choices and dietary habits play a really important role in maintaining our physical health. Now, stress is a big one. So stress can really, if we're really stressed out, that can lead to a whole range of issues. You probably wouldn't have thought stress can cause this many problems, but stress can lead to issues with our cardiovascular health. It can increase our blood pressure, our heart rate, raising the risk of heart disease and stroke. Stress can weaken the immune system, making the body more susceptible to infections and illness. It can affect the digestive system and contribute to GI issues and irritable bowel syndrome. It can cause muscle tension, leading to headaches and back pain and just general discomfort. Stress can affect our sleep, of course. So if we have a high stress level, we can ruin our sleep patterns and lead to insomnia or poor sleep quality, which affects health. And then, of course, mental health as well. So if we are really stressed out, that can exacerbate or enhance mental health conditions like anxiety and depression. All right, and then smoking, alcohol, and illegal drugs. Of course, these are going to negatively affect our health in a variety of ways. Smoking causes respiratory issues, cardiovascular problems. It can predispose us to a heap of cancers like lung cancer, but not only lung cancer, also mouth and throat cancer, bladder cancer as well. The risk is increased by smoking. It can reduce our immune function, so weakening the immune system, making us more susceptible to infection and diseases. Alcohol can cause liver diseases such as fatty liver or liver cirrhosis. It can cause cardiovascular diseases or issues like high blood pressure or arrhythmias, which is where you have an irregular heartbeat. It can cause digestive problems like ulcers. Ulcers come from, or one of the risks of alcohol is stomach ulcers. And mental health. So alcohol contributes to mental health problems like depression and anxiety. It can also impair, of course, our judgment and the functioning of our brain when we have had a few alcoholic drinks at the time. And then illegal drugs. Illegal drugs have varied health effects. Different drugs have different impacts, of course, but the most common issues include cardiovascular, respiratory issues, and neurological damage. So that's brain damage. It can exacerbate mental health conditions. Of course, I'm sure you've seen people who are on very hard drugs and they're having hallucinations or severe mood swings or paranoia. It can increase our risk of infectious diseases through sharing needles or engaging in risky behaviors. it might increase our risk of infections like HIV and hepatitis, and then impaired functioning. So it can impair our motor functions where we're not able to control our body properly, basically, and that might lead to accidents or injuries. Okay, education level and work. This is an interesting one. You wouldn't really necessarily think that our education level and our work can affect our physical health, but it can, and it's in slightly different ways. So, the higher educated you are, the more likely you are to have good physical health. And you can see in that pyramid, sort of the pyramid of education, with a high school diploma all the way up to a PhD, which is the highest level of education that you can have. So with a good education, we are more likely to get a good job. In a good job, we're more likely to have benefits that include private health insurance, access to healthcare like dentists. It gives us greater health literacy. So health literacy is an understanding of our health. So educated individuals generally have better health understanding, and that leads to healthier lifestyle choices and the improved management of health conditions. So if I get a disease, I might know how to handle it in the best way already if I've gone through some sort of education that included that. With a greater income, I have better access to good quality food, to safe housing, and to healthcare as well. Educated people are more likely to engage in preventative health measures. So this might mean like regular checkups and getting your screenings done at the right time. So for men, that might be prostate screening when you get to 40 years old. Health behaviors as well. Higher education levels are associated with healthier behaviors such as reduced smoking rates and increased physical activity. So the more educated you are, the less likely you are to be smoking and to be physically inactive. Obviously, this is just trends. It doesn't mean that, necessarily someone who dropped out of high school is going to be smoking and not going to be doing any physical activity. It doesn't apply to everyone. It's just a trend. It's a relationship. So it's not black and white. It's just something that's been noticed over time. This is quite an interesting slide as well. So just to show you, this graph here is looking at childhood obesity. So the percentage of children who are overweight or obese in Australia particularly. And we can see some interesting comparisons. So let's first look at that maroon colored, those two maroon colored lines. So you've got children from a 2-parent family versus children from a 1-parent family. And children from a 1-parent family are more likely to be overweight during childhood. Again, you've got disability and no disability. Children who have a disability are more likely to be overweight. You've got major cities and regional and remote areas. So if you live in a major city, you're less likely to be overweight. And then lowest socioeconomic areas and highest socioeconomic areas. So think of this as money. If you're living in a poor area versus in a rich area, living in a poor area makes you more likely to be overweight as a child. Now, there's so many reasons as to why children in a 1-parent family or who have disabilities or from regional and remote cities are more likely to be overweight. The reasons are endless, and we're not going to get into trying to find out what the reasons are because it's just impossible, but it's just interesting to notice the trends, and you might be able to sort of pinpoint a few. For example, in a lower socioeconomic area, they might not have as much access to healthy food, and they might be struggling with money and just buy cheap processed food at the grocery store, and perhaps that's why there's a higher percentage of overweight children compared to higher socioeconomic areas. Okay, last factor that affects our physical health is relationships. So relationships can significantly impact our health in quite a few ways. Firstly, if we have good relationships with our family, friends, etc., we have some emotional support and mental health. So healthy relationships can reduce the risk of mental health issues like depression and anxiety. Relationships can actually improve our physical health as well. So if we have good relationships, it's linked to better physical health outcomes like lower blood pressure, improved immune function, which is really interesting. People who have good relationships are also more likely to engage in healthy behaviors like regular exercise and balanced eating. They have strong social networks and social support, and it can reduce loneliness. And loneliness is actually associated with various health problems, particularly heart disease. So it's not good to be too lonely. All right. So those are the factors which may affect our physical health. And we've gone through each of those 7. Now we're going to look at benchmarks of good physical health. So what measures can we take? What benchmarks can we look at in order to understand or to sort of estimate that our health is good and going well? The first one is blood pressure. So if you've been to the doctor, you've gotten your blood pressure measured. I can guarantee it. It's where they put that cuff on your arm and it squeezes your arm really tight and gives you a reading. Now, the blood pressure is a measure of how much pressure is on the walls of your arteries as it pumps blood through the body. Now, normal blood pressure is 120/80, and what that means is 120 is the systolic, and you can see systolic up the y-axis, and diastolic along the x-axis of that graph. Systolic, that number refers to the pressure of the blood on the arterial walls when the heart contracts. Diastolic is when the heart relaxes, how much pressure is going through the arteries. That's why diastolic is always lower than systolic. So systolic is when the blood is rushing through. Diastolic is when the blood has sort of stopped and there's that break in the heartbeat. Now, a normal blood pressure is an indicator of cardiovascular health. If we have high blood pressure, that increases our risk of all sorts of diseases, mainly heart disease. It increases our risk of stroke and so on. So it's a good predictor of our overall health. Now, in order to measure blood pressure, you put the cuff on your arm and the machine squeezes it tight and gives you a number. So you can see in the picture here, it says 145/84. Now that is classified as high blood pressure, which is called hypertension. And hypertension is associated with a lack of exercise and a bad diet. So again, it's a lifestyle issue for the most part. Next benchmark is our resting heart rate. So the average resting heart rate for an adult is 60 to 80 beats per minute, but this can change depending on age, depending on gender. So men and women have different average resting heart rates. It's a predictor of cardiovascular fitness. So the fitter we are, the stronger our heart is and the less it needs to beat. So that's why fit people have a lower resting heart rate. It's also a predictor of longevity, but important to mention here that resting heart rate has got a very big genetic component. So it's never really good to compare yourself to these numbers or to compare yourself to your classmates. The best thing to do is compare you to you. So see how your resting heart rate has changed over time because there is a big genetic component. The reason why men and women have different average resting heart rates, you can see that men generally is a bit lower than women, is because men have a bigger heart. With a bigger heart, they can pump more blood around the body. Women have a smaller heart, therefore it needs to beat a little bit more to get that blood and that oxygen to the tissues that need it. In order to measure resting heart rate, you can of course use like an Apple Watch. The best thing to do is to wear your Apple Watch for a few days and then get the average. It should normally tell you. You can also count your resting heart rate in your neck or in your radial pulse, which is just underneath the thumb. You can count it for 15 seconds and then times it by 4, and then you get your 1 minute resting heart rate because heart rate is per minute, right? Just be aware that if you're stressed out, if you're nervous, if you're anxious, when you calculate your heart rate at that time, it's probably going to be higher than it would if you were just really relaxed and resting. So important things to consider there, that even if you just measured it right now and you've just been out for a walk and gotten home and watched this video, it's probably not going to be completely representative of your resting heart rate. That's why it's better to wear a watch for a few days and take that average. Next benchmark of good physical health is body composition. So looking at our body and what it is composed of. Now we can put body composition into two main categories. That is fat-free mass and fat mass. So it makes it really easy. Fat-free mass includes everything but the fat. So it includes muscles, bones, organs, our connective tissues like our ligaments, our tendons. It includes water. Whereas our fat mass is looking at two types of fat. So we have essential fat and non-essential fat. The essential fat is what our body needs to function properly. It's the fat within our brain, within our sort of hormonal system. So hormones need fat to absorb and be carried around the body. So there's some sort of level of essential fat that we're always going to have. For men, it's around 2 to 5%. So if you ever see on Instagram a guy saying he's at 1% body fat, he's either lying or he's used a really inaccurate measurement technique. For women, it's 10 to 13%. So extremely unlikely that you'll see a woman at 9% body fat if they've measured it correctly. Non-essential fat is our subcutaneous fat. So subcutaneous means under the skin. It's the fat that lies under our skin. It's the fat that you can pinch on your tummy, on your arm. That's subcutaneous fat. Visceral fat is the fat that surrounds our organs. So visceral fat is not good for health. Visceral fat is the bad fat. It's the one that you can't really see. So you could have someone who's quite skinny and appears to be very slim, but has quite a high amount of visceral fat, and that's not good for health. So remember, visceral fat is around the organs inside the body, and subcutaneous fat is under the skin, almost like on the outside of the body. It's the fat that you see. Now, again, for body fat percentages, we have some normative data here. So 10 to 13% for women, 2 to 5% for men. That's the essential amount. You won't see anything really below that. You've got some numbers for athletes, for someone who's fit, average, and then for obese, it's 32% or higher for women and 25% or higher for men. Notice men and women have quite different ranges there. Women carry a lot more fat for reproductive reasons, especially, and men have less fat because of things like testosterone, which reduces the fat level in the body. In order to measure body composition, there's some simple ways to do it. There's some more complicated ways to do it. So waist to hip ratio gives us a good idea of the overall body composition. This is more than just calculating your weight, right? So waist to hip ratio can give us some idea of health as well. We'll see what that is in a second. And then we have BMI, the one that everyone knows about, which gives you a number and classes you into underweight, healthy, overweight, obese, or severely obese. And then we have DEXA scan. DEXA scan is the gold standard. The DEXA scan is what I showed you in the previous slide here. So this is a guy doing a DEXA scan. If you want an accurate body fat percentage, this is the way to do it. This is like the only sort of standard method where it's actually correct. If you're using those scales that give you a percentage where you hold your hands onto those little metal things, they're not accurate. So DEXA scan is the accurate way to measure it. It's not very accessible though, so they're hard to come by and they are expensive if you want to buy and do one. Okay, so waist to hip ratio. In order to measure that, we take the narrowest part of the waist and divide it by the widest part of the hips. And we can class that into 3 different categories. So low risk, moderate risk, and high risk. For men, that's less than 0.9 for low risk. Moderate risk is 0.9 to 0.5, and then high risk is above 0.95. So if you have a measuring tape at home, you can calculate your waist to hip ratio and look back at this table to determine where you sit. For BMI, It's kilograms divided by meters squared. You can easily use a BMI calculator. If you type that into Google, BMI calculator, you put in your height, you put in your weight, and it will tell you what your BMI is. BMI is good. It's a quick way of getting an estimate of sort of body composition, but there are limitations with BMI. And firstly, that is because it only takes into account our weight. It doesn't take into account how much of that weight is muscle and how much of that weight is fat. It sort of groups them together. And we're going to see how that issue arises in just a second. But importantly, it's excess fat, excess adipose tissue that's the cause of bad comorbid diseases, chronic conditions. It's not total weight, it's fat. So BMI, when it just takes into account total weight, we can get sort of an inaccurate picture of our health. So let's see what those limitations are. So for example here, I know this is a little bit of a confusing graph when you first look at it, but let's talk through it. We've got age along the x-axis. So we've got multiple groups of people of different ages. We have weight. So look at the body weight up the right-hand side. Body weight refers to the dotted line at the top. So you can see at all the different ages, these people are pretty much all 80 kilograms. All right, so the dotted line at 80 kilograms. Body fat on the left-hand side is referring to the columns. So when you're looking at the columns, you're reading body fat. So even though all these people weigh the same, their body fat is drastically different. The 25-year-olds have 15% body fat compared to the 75-year-olds who are almost at 30% body fat, even though they weigh the same. So their BMI would be the same. We can see big differences in the actual body fat percentage. And you can see that especially with this DEXA scan here. So let me talk you through what the DEXA scan is first. These are the results from the DEXA scan. It gives us body fat percentage, not only of the total body, but also of all the different regions of the body. It tells us about our total mass. It gives us fat mass. It gives us lean mass. And then it also gives us our bone mineral content, BMC, which is right on the right-hand side. This is how much our bones weigh. So obviously the denser our bones, they're going to weigh more. The more brittle our bones are, they're going to weigh less. And then the last thing that the DEXA scan does is it gives us a BMI. So let's have a look at this guy. His BMI is overweight. You can see in that little line down the bottom, he is classed as overweight. Let's have a look at his body fat percentage. He is 11.6% body fat and he weighs 108 kilograms. So he is super muscly and super lean. However, BMI tells me he's overweight. This guy would be very healthy in terms of his body composition. He's got hardly any fat, only 11 kilograms of fat for 108 kilograms of a person, body fat being only 11.6%. So this is where we need to be careful with BMI, where it doesn't sort of ring true for the entire population. Okay, next benchmark of good physical health is alcohol consumption. So if we look at how much alcohol we're drinking over the week and we're meeting these guidelines, that's pretty good. So for men, it's up to 2 standard drinks per day, and for women, it's up to 1 standard drink per day. And the guideline is to avoid binge drinking, which is consuming 4 or more drinks on a single occasion. That's not good for our health. All right. Next benchmark is sleep. If we're getting 6 to 9 hours of sleep every night, that's going to be good for our health. We can measure that. There's watches that assess your sleep. In terms of the effects of sleep on health, there's physical and metabolic health. So sleep boosts our immune function and our cardiovascular health. It also regulates our hunger hormones and it aids in our muscle recovery as well. So very important for athletes. Mental and athletes probably need more than 9 hours actually. Mental and cognitive function. So good sleep enhances our memory, our cognitive performance, so our brain performance and our mood, and then it improves our overall well-being as well. So our physical performance, our coordination, and the overall quality of our life. Okay, diet and hydration is our final benchmark of good physical health. So Firstly, energy intake should be in balance with energy expenditure. So this means we're eating the amount of calories that we need. If I'm not burning much over the day, I shouldn't be eating as much as a professional athlete. A professional athlete's burning more energy is going to need to eat more food. If I eat more food than I burn, this is what leads to obesity and to fat gain. Total fat intake should not exceed 30% of your energy intake. That's an important one as well. So you don't want to have a diet that's too high in fats. It can increase the amount of fats in our circulatory system and cholesterol in our circulatory system that causes that narrowing of the arteries. We also want to limit the intake of sugar to less than 10% of total energy intake. So this is processed sugars like lollies and things like that. And we want to keep salt intake to less than 5 grams per day as well. So there's our benchmarks of good physical health, things that we can measure, see if we meet or if we don't meet, and sort of determine if our health is on track. Now, in terms of health screening questionnaires, this is the next thing we're going to be looking at. There's so many different health screening questionnaires. You can find them all on Google. And these questionnaires, you sort of tick boxes and answer questions. And at the end, it gives you some sort of result as to your health within that specific benchmark. So the first one is the Dietary Guidelines Adherence Questionnaire. So specifically looking at your diet. Then we have the Global Physical Activity Questionnaire, asking questions about how much physical activity you're doing, what intensity you're doing, and telling you if you meet the guidelines, if you're active enough for your age and gender. We've got a Sleep Quality Index. There's the Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test. So if you're drinking too much alcohol, and there's many more. There's millions of these. If you go onto Google and you look for a health screening questionnaire, you'll find plenty of them. So these are important to consider. We also have questionnaires for physical activity screening. So this is important for people who are going to start a physical activity regime or program. You're going to want to do this in things like your IA when you have someone start an exercise program with you. If you're going to ask your athletes or your participants to do some form of exercise in your IA, you're going to want to use the PARQ. It's Physical Activity Readiness Scale, and it's designed to assess an individual's readiness to engage in physical activity or exercise, and it sort of helps to identify if there's any potential health risks or medical conditions that might need some special consideration before doing this exercise program. So we're going to have a look at this one in class. All right, that is the end of prescription of exercise for health.